Hello and welcome to this video giving the top tips we believe would have helped us the most when we first started brewing. There are of course always going to be various tips that you wish you knew before you got into the hobby or started brewing on a larger scale. Little things and big things. The diversity of thoughts will more or less be as diverse as everybody's experiences in brewing. Some people will be more familiar with brewing, or will have a better grasp of certain concepts. These people will need very different kinds of hints and tips at the very start of their brewing journey than we might have needed, and this may or may not apply to you. There are some very common beginner's mistakes that we have previously spent some time describing, and the beginner's mistakes are somewhat different to the tips that would be of most use. For example, simple mistakes like failing to sterilize and sanitize are common and will, depending on how blasé you are, be more or less of an issue. Tips will vary in that they're not necessarily obvious in what they are, and that they aren't going to adversely affect your brewing journey by not adhering to them, but by knowing them now, you can head off the difficulties and extra expenses associated with the things we're about to describe. The first is relatively straightforward, and it's probably more relevant to beer brewing than any other area within brewing. Get the bigger or biggest kettle you can practically move and store. The simple reality is that even if you start with something very small sized, you will gradually increase the size and volume of what you're going to be working with. A bigger kettle will accommodate your initial small brewing needs and grow with you, or at least accommodate your growth in brewing over time. If you're going to be brewing beer in particular, this is especially useful. Going from what is effectively kit brewing all the way through to all grain brewing, you will need a much larger kettle than you would if you were only going to use kit brewing, if you even want to use a kettle at all for that. That would really just be going through the motions for the sake of going through the motions, rather than gaining anything from it. If you're looking at partial mash, you will need some sort of kettle, and reality is, starting out larger means you only have to buy the one rather than replace it. The second is somewhat more controversial, let's say. Create your own yeast starters. Many home brewers will explain that they buy yeast fresh, and that's because fresh yeast will both be relatively pure for the intended purpose, the strain that is needed, and perform most effectively. The downside to this is that it costs good money to get good yeast. In order to get adequate fermentation and get the fermentation going strong, pitching a good amount of yeast initially is needed. This is where the yeast starter comes in. The yeast starter is your liquid culture, generally a liquid culture, of yeast that's added to ensure that the fermentation kicks off properly. This is a relatively small and easy to do thing. By doing so, you reduce many of the problems associated with yeast going from either a dry powdered form or a liquid form into a much larger container full of water and sugars to ferment that may, for a brief time, stun the yeast and prevent it from doing its job. Then there is the addition of oxygen. Adding oxygen to your fermentation, at least initially, will help the yeast convert any of the sugar in there to alcohol. If you don't have that, you will not get the conversion of primarily malt and the malt extract into the desired alcohol. There are various ways to do this. This includes using oxygen infusion from a gas tank, or by pouring liquid from a greater height. The next few tips are a little more fundamental. The first one is fairly straightforward. Don't start off with a very strong alcohol beer. The reality is, start with the basics and go from there. One of the reasons why you want to start with something relatively mundane in terms of the skill level is that you'll find that it's much easier to be able to work with that and get used to it and practice all of the skills required and build up those skills and strength in what you're doing to then allow you to understand not only the process, but the needs in each process, what you need to tweak to make it work, and then allow you to develop more complicated products. As a tangent from this, it's also worth trying to brew those things that are relatively commonplace. As a new beginner, brewing something very simple but very well will serve you a lot better than trying to brew something very esoteric and complicated and failing spectacularly. While it may sound completely ridiculous and silly, try brewing a simple ethanol wash initially. See how you go and just what sort of alcohol content you can get out of that. You'll find that there are a whole range of factors that can affect just how much can be made from a given amount of sugar over a given amount of time in set volume. If you aren't looking at something like a spirit wash, then stick to your more fundamental beers, stouts, porters, and brown ales. Further to the idea of sticking to basic recipes and something solid but reliable to develop not only your confidence in yourself, but the skills you need, try to use filtered water. Yes, there are some breweries that take great pride in their water and some of the quasi-contaminants in it that make significant contributions to the flavor. If you are on mains water, which is town water for some people or comes from a city supply, look at filtering it. Filtering it will take out some of the most common things that will confound your results. Water will vary from a town supply often, and by ensuring it is filtered, you remove the vast majority of this variability. That means that your yeast and the consequential brewing that you will do should come out relatively consistently. We mentioned early on that you may choose to start with smaller batches and grow in size, and this is a good idea. Brew smaller volumes initially. A smaller amount, say 5 or 10 liters, is much easier to handle, measure out the various ingredients, make multiple batches of, be able to examine it. It will ferment much sooner. You'll have a much less difficult time bottling it, and so on. All of these things lend themselves to using a smaller volume. You can practice more frequently. If something goes wrong, your investment in time and materials isn't anywhere near as significant as if you were to lose a 25-liter batch. Over time, as you find not only recipes that you're comfortable with, but your skills are developing, you can increase the volume in which you're brewing. This will eventually lead to the use of much larger equipment, and why we mentioned early on, although not necessarily needed in the initial stages. It is worth getting larger equipment and then using that down the track. From the very beginning, you should be taking notes. And this might seem silly. You might be thinking, it can't be that hard to remember what you've done with a given recipe. This is true if you are only ever going to brew a small repertoire of beer or similar brew of your choice. If you're going to try and practice and diversify that repertoire, you're going to want to know what you've done to make each one successful or what caused each to fail. If there was a particular batch of yeast that you can track back through your records and find that that is what was causing problems, you can replace it. If you know that there are certain ingredients that you can use to substitute for others that are much harder to get, and that they will successfully substitute for some recipes but not others, this is worth knowing. This also somewhat goes hand in hand with the next issue, and that's trying to brew something much more difficult and often craft. While it is true that with the assistance of a mentor or someone far more experienced, This is entirely possible. Being too ambitious too early is an easy way to get something going horribly wrong, especially if you are very new to this. Individual steps or processes may take time to develop and understand and get familiar and comfortable with. In order to do that, you should be working on simpler steps or processes that either build up to that, or recipes that use more simple processes but incorporate several of the more complicated processes. Trying to jump into too advanced a level or too difficult a process too quickly will only discourage you, waste your time and effort, and possibly produce something that makes you not want to ferment anything at all. As you go through your brewing journey, there's a good chance that you're going to begin acquiring various pieces of equipment. These are going to provide you with the opportunity to get more and more precise measurements as you go along. You may begin with a simple mechanical set of scales. These will weigh things but not give you very much in the way of specific values. You may know that the amount of whatever it is weighs in somewhere in a 10-gram bracket. In other cases, it may be up to 50 or 100-gram brackets. As you go through, you will acquire equipment that is much more precise, often down to parts of a gram, rather than being several grams in its range. This can be very useful not only for you to be able to get the most accurate records, but to know how much you're adding in and get that very specifically down. This is especially important if we're talking about something like modifying water, the addition of extra salts, ions, or metals. The precision measurements, along with the notes you're keeping, will allow you to know how you need to modify water to be able to counteract, say for example, excess calcium in your town water supply. The final consideration is temperature control. For many people, they may just decide to let the yeast ferment as it will. Environment always finds a way, and that sort of argument. And yes, to a large degree, the fermentation will occur. The difficulties with fermenting something that's at too hot or too cold a temperature have been described in past videos by us. These are that they can produce off flavors, create undesirable toxic byproducts, or cease fermenting altogether and fall out of suspension. There's also a whole range of other possible events in between. For most people, the two biggest considerations are going to be the production of excess alcohol or the failure to ferment, creating an extremely sweet fermentation. Remember to always have thermometers available and preferably be able to have them permanently attached to your fermenting vessels, as well as in the area that you're fermenting. This gives you not only the temperature of the fermentation, but the environment, and you'll have some idea about the difference between ambient temperature and temperature of your fermentation. If it's going to be too warm, you'll know you'll get more alcohol. If it's too cold, you know there'll be more residual sugars. These are just a few of the tips that we could think of that might help you, and certainly things to be aware of when you first begin to ferment. Brewing itself can be an interesting and enjoyable hobby, but you need to take it in steps and not try to overreach right away. There's also a certain point at which you could buy larger equipment and save yourself some hassle. It's also worth keeping records of what you've done and how it's wound up going for you, even if it's nothing more than to know that if you put so much sugar into your fermentation, whether that's as malt or various other fermentables, you'll get out so much ethanol or such and such a flavor. All of these things will vary based on very specific conditions for you, and generally the local environment. Your records and everything else we've mentioned will be your best friend in being able to identify just what's going on there. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.